Imagine you're standing in a store. In front of you are two pairs of boots. One costs $30, the other costs $150. Most people never seriously consider the expensive pair. They look at the price tag, shake their head, and reach for the cheaper one because spending less money feels responsible, it feels smart, it feels disciplined. Why spend an extra $120 on something that does the same job? At least that's what it looks like. So you buy the cheaper boots, you walk out feeling good about yourself, like you made the financially sensible decision, like you saved money. But 10 years later, that decision has cost you twice as much. And that's the strange thing about money. Some of the decisions that feel smartest in the moment turn out to be the most expensive, not next week, not next month, years later. The problem is that almost nobody thinks that far ahead. We calculate what something costs today. We rarely calculate what it costs over time. And that one mistake might explain why two people can make what looks like the exact same financial decision, yet end up in completely different places. Because this isn't really a story about boots. It's a story about a way of thinking. A way of thinking that feels responsible, feels practical, feels financially smart, and yet, for a lot of people, it quietly becomes one of the most expensive habits they ever develop. A year passes, the boots wear out. So you buy another pair, then another, then another. 10 years later, you've spent $300 replacing boots. The person who bought the $150 pair, they spent $150 once. There's actually a name for this idea, the boots theory. The idea that people with less money often end up paying more over time because they can't always afford the option that lasts, and once you hear it, it sounds obvious. Of course, quality matters. Of course, cheap things break. But the boots aren't really the interesting part. The interesting part is what they reveal. Like, most people don't make decisions based on cost. They make decisions based on price. The problem wasn't the boots. The problem was how we measured them. We looked at the price. We ignored the cost. And those aren't the same thing. The price was $30. The cost was $300. One was visible. The other took 10 years to appear. That's why the cheap boots felt like a win, even though they weren't. And once you notice that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. The cheap office chair that falls apart after a year. The bargain appliance that dies just outside the warranty. The phone charger that needs replacing every few months. The used car that seemed affordable until it practically moved into the repair shop. The cheapest option often isn't actually cheaper. It's just cheaper today. The real bill arrives later. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because later doesn't feel real. Today does. If the cheapest option often costs more, why do we keep choosing it? Because the human brain loves immediate rewards. Saving money today feels good. You feel responsible. You feel disciplined. You feel like you're getting ahead. The future cost doesn't create that feeling. Because the future isn't standing in front of you. The future doesn't have a price tag. The future doesn't ask for your credit card. The future is invisible. And invisible costs are easy to ignore. That's why people focus on the $120 they saved today. Not the $300 they'll spend over the next decade. The cheap option doesn't feel expensive because it doesn't charge you all at once. It charges you in installments. A little repair here, a replacement there, a problem that keeps coming back. And because those costs arrive one at a time, we rarely connect them back to the original decision. We simply accept them, we pay them, and move on. Until one day we realize we've spent far more than we ever intended. But maybe that's why this idea matters. Because we're not really talking about boots anymore. Boots are just where the pattern is easiest to see. The real danger is when you start making every decision this way. When every choice is judged by one question. What's going to cost me the least right now? Not, what's going to serve me best 5 years from now? Because those questions often produce very different answers. The cheapest option offers immediate relief. The best option often asks for patience. The cheapest option reduces today's discomfort. The best option often creates tomorrow's opportunity. And most of us spend our lives caught between those two choices. Not because we're lazy, not because we're foolish, because immediate relief feels real. The future doesn't, at least not until it arrives, and by then the bill is already due. But before we go any further, there's something important we need to acknowledge. Not everyone buys the cheaper boots because they want to. Sometimes they buy them because they have no choice. And that's where the boots theory becomes uncomfortable. If you only have $30 in your account, the $150 boots aren't really an option. You know they'll last longer. You know they're probably the smarter purchase. You know they'll save money over time. But none of that matters if you can't afford them today. The cruel part is that the people who most need the $150 boots are often the people who can only afford the $30 pair. So they spend years paying more. Not because they made the wrong decision, because they never had the chance to make the right one. And once you see that, you start noticing it everywhere. The person with savings can handle an emergency. The person without savings often pays interest on top of the emergency. The person with breathing room can think long term. The person under pressure has to think about next week. The same setback affects people differently. Because money doesn't just buy things. Money buys options. It buys flexibility. It buys time. It buys breathing room. It buys the ability to absorb mistakes without your entire life falling apart. The less money you have, the smaller your margin for error becomes. A small problem becomes a crisis. A minor inconvenience becomes an emergency. And eventually you stop asking, what's best for me long term? And start asking, what can I survive right now? That's not poor decision making. That's survival. And survival is expensive. The expensive thing isn't always what you buy. Sometimes it's the situation you're trapped inside. And that's why being broke can become so costly. Not because poor people spend more, but because they often have fewer choices available to them. But the biggest costs in life aren't attached to products. They're attached to decisions. Because the same mindset that buys the cheap boots can quietly shape an entire life. People choose the option with the lowest immediate cost, the safest job, the familiar routine, the opportunity they postpone, the skill they never learn, the risk they never take. Because every one of those choices feels sensible in the moment, just like the cheap boots. People constantly ask, what if I spend this money and it doesn't work? But they rarely ask, what if I spend the next 5 years doing nothing? What if the real cost isn't taking action? What if the real cost is standing still? Maybe the most expensive thing you ever bought wasn't a car. Maybe it was a year you stayed somewhere you had already outgrown. Maybe it was an opportunity you kept postponing. Maybe it was a skill you never learned. Maybe it was a dream you slowly talked yourself out of because waiting felt safer. Those decisions rarely feel expensive. That's what makes them dangerous. They feel practical, responsible, reasonable. Just like the cheap boots. The cost doesn't arrive immediately. It arrives years later, as missed opportunities, as regret, as wondering where the time went, as realizing that what felt safe was often just familiar. Maybe that's why some people spend years trying to save money, yet somehow never move forward. Because they aren't optimizing for value. They're optimizing for immediate relief. And those aren't the same thing. Immediate relief makes today easier. Value makes tomorrow better. The problem is that tomorrow doesn't vote. Today does. So we keep choosing what feels good now, what feels safe now, what costs less now. And we rarely notice what those choices are quietly taking from us. Because life doesn't charge you once. It charges you over time. The cheap boots, the cheap car, the safe job, the skill you never learned, the opportunity you postponed, the risk you never took. They're all drawing from the same account, your future. And maybe that's the saving strategy that's actually keeping people broke. Not spending too much, not buying the wrong things, but optimizing every decision for immediate relief. Every purchase, every opportunity, every risk, every delay. Every time we ask, what's the cheapest option? Instead of, what's this going to cost me later? Because by the time most people realize what those choices have cost them, the money isn't what they miss. The years are,